This is a production of Cornell University.
Keeping with us here, this is the third week of our Sports Turf webinar. As always, we'll start with Dr. Rossi. He'll give us a little bit of an overview what this current situation is, growing season-wise. We might get some perspective on the COVID situation, certain restrictions, minimum maintenance, things like that. And then we're joined by Dr. Roch Gaussoin out of the University of Nebraska, probably one of the most published and accomplished researchers we're going to find out here. So I'm sure that'll be a great conversation. We'll have some great discussions on cultivation and certainly many different topics at the end of this. So, Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. For the record, Roch, I didn't put him up to that. I didn't put him up to it. He looked to your prolific.
I looked at his CV. I looked at the CV, and
I haven't done a CV in probably 10 years. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. And as you can tell, we're going to have a very lively conversation when we get to Roch in a minute. Carl, can you hear me okay?
All good?
Yeah. All right. All good. Good. All right. So again, welcome to another week of this. This is our third week of doing it. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you watching it on, on recording, welcome as well. Brian Winka did a wonderful job in a recent tweet. I'm a big fan of Brian's. We've done a podcast together talking about that initial concept him and Munshaw were working on called Blue Muta. Posted something on his Twitter account that really says it all. And I have to say, in the Northeastern United States, this is exactly what it's been like for the last several years, never mind just April. And then to only maybe get a good stretch of weather and to have the field closed for the current situation. So we'll try to distract you for the next 30 minutes. We'll be pretty close to trying to get this done so you can get on to the other things that are important in the day. So just a message from your land-grant institution here in New York, and I know my colleague at the land-grant institution in the great state of Nebraska has the same mindset that right now we need to support each other, and the best universities and learning centers can do is to try to collaborate with each other because solutions will come about. And Roch knows me well enough to know I think I know a lot, but I know enough to know I know barely anything. And that's why it's great to have the collaborators join us. And we've had a long list of really good scientists. Thanks again to Roch for joining us. So we have our weekly newsletter in addition to us yakking here on the computer. We've been writing this up now. I've been journaling the growing seasons for the last 21 years. And if you'd like to get a copy of this, we're covering topics more in depth in writing and then echoing it in the webinar. So you're getting a double dose of our mindset and the way we're thinking about approaching it here at Cornell. Well, I have to say, Pam Sherrod in the Sports Turf program at Ohio State, to me, in many ways, is the gold standard of a program that, comprehensively addresses sports field management. I'd put Goatley's program, certainly and Iowa State's program. And, Roch knows these programs very well over the years. And Pam did a wonderful job of putting together this 10 maintenance practices to focus on during this particular issue. And I think the first thing is she mentions, and I commend this to you, Carl will put the link up to these resources that we cite during the webinar and the things that Roch and I talk about. But first and foremost, in many ways, golf course superintendents are having to deal with this, grounds managers are having to deal with it, and sports field managers are having to deal with it. Restricting the use of your turf grass areas. You can't use it. We keep it for you to use, but right now, for whatever reason, you can't use it. For the activity is restricted, the liability insurance, we're not going to maintain it. You name it. In my mind, a lot of the work of sports field managers falls first and foremost on managing your facility, keeping people safe, your workforce safe, and of course, the users of the facility safe. Now, what's really interesting in New York State, we have, thinking about universities and school districts, we have the New York State School Facilities Management Institute that recently did a survey. For those of you that are joining from school districts, wondering about sports fields or municipalities or larger facilities run by the state, they did a survey which says which statement best describes your current operations. And they got 80 responses, which I thought was actually pretty good. It's probably 10%, 15% of the staff, the school district staff anyway. So the majority of them have limited maintenance and performing just building checks and just emergency stuff. A few of them have no maintenance staff on site. And I don't really know how much of this relates to sports fields, but it's some data locally on removing some of the confusion about what other facilities are doing with regard to their sports fields. Surely the majority of activities that a lot of our fields would be used for intentionally is not happening. A lot of those things are not allowed. Now, every place I look, I see that people are having to break up these sorts of things. So they are happening to some degree. So again, it adds to the confusion about how you approach managing your fields at this time. Well, here at Cornell, we got a hard decision. Everybody's gone. Everybody's gone. Uh-oh. We're good? We're good, Carl?
No, we're good.
All right. We got a hard situation. Well, a hard line. We know exactly what's happening. The kids are gone. There's no sports. And no one's going to be using this place until mid-July. So our sports turf manager, Josh Fontaine, put together a minimum action plan for COVID, and we're sending it to the athletic department. We're making everybody aware of the kinds of things that we're doing, including the impact on labor hours, right? This is something that everyone is having to deal with. Now, we're really fortunate because between Carl and Josh, and Chris Sitko, our other sports field management expert, we've developed sort of how long does it take to do things for the way our fields are set up and the way we manage these things. And so we know on our acreages, our natural grass acreages, that we're caring for the labor. So I'd encourage you operationally to start thinking about these sorts of things, depending on how long this goes, the pressure we get to rehire people to return to normal, or the pressure we get to stay closed, communicating the impact on what's possible and what you can do. Roch and I are going to talk about soil management in a minute. You're not doing any soil management if there's one guy on 15 acres. Okay. So first, what do you need to do certain things? And again, Pam and the folks at the Ohio State University, forgive me for not bringing that up to begin with, talks about mowing, what's needed. And, they've got regional differences there. Fungicide applications, only if disease is active. We don't have anything active in the Northeast. We got barely any mowing going on north of a certain line we'll look at in a second. And then finally, don't be putting on quick release sources if you don't have traffic. Right? You're trying to slow growth to some degree. Now, this is going to be dependent on how much passive traffic you're getting. A lot of people are as busy as they've ever been because people are just walking around all over the place. And you have to determine how much access people have to your sports fields. So let's look at some weather. Among my favorite things to do, right? So this is what it was last week when we met. And you can see that the 50-degree mark was barely into South Jersey. And now it looks like we're in the mid to low 50s into the Hudson Valley, onto Long Island. It's just getting started. This is a good barometer to keep your eye on at our forecast website for the Northeast about where the soil temperatures are. Now, this was last week what was expected. And in general, while it was a little bit above normal, the majority of the northern part of the Northeast hasn't accumulated many growing degree days at all. And we don't expect to accumulate many this week. This was last week, and this is this week. So we'll get a few into the metropolitan New York area. But since March 1st, in northern climates, north of the Pennsylvania-New York border, we haven't accumulated any base 50 growing degree days since the beginning of March. All right, and here's the growing degree day forecast. Now, what does this all mean? There's going to be very little progress of the growing season in the Northeast this coming week. Heck, in upstate, we're going to get some snow in many parts of upstate New York. All right. So when we look at this one measure of the potential of a cool season grass plant to grow, and you look at an average temperature of 50 degrees, which we're not even getting to yet, that mark gives us less than 25% of active growth. Right? We're not really getting much active growth. Any mowing we're doing in a lot of our northern areas could be related to just cleaning up recreational mowing, keeping people busy. But if you're doing that, we certainly are promoting, and we talked about last week in this venue, raising the height of cut. So we're not going to go into the mowing situation again. We covered it last week pretty extensively in our webinar with Bill, another great Nebraska faculty. Now, one of the things that's going on throughout, sports fields everywhere is, spring baseball would normally be happening. And again, the Ohio State University gave a good recommendation. Get the conditioner off, loose material, store it, roll and firm the dirt, right? Just into the infield, hand pull stray weeds, and raking may be needed. Now, a lot of this can be minimal if you did a good job of putting the skin to get to bed well, right? If you left it sort of in shambles last fall, now it's going to be tougher to get it to minimal maintenance now. But if it's nice and clean now, it ought to be pretty straightforward to keep it clean. And there's some simple things you can do to manage that that's unique to the sports fields. Now, STMA has done a good job in really relating a lot of great information from practical users. And I stress this with every audience that I talk to. This particular high school turfgrass science professor, did an excellent job about talking to people about this issue, about moving traffic around, about coaching them and training them about the way they like to learn. And I think this kind of information is enormously valuable at this time when a lot of communication is important, right? No one's using the field. What are the realistic things we could be doing out here? So let me just finish up here, because this is the important stuff, Roch. This is the stuff I know that, number one, we've got a sports field website. Number two, this is the cultivation practices that Minna wrote up. I know you've done a similar thing. This is the one on our sports field website. Let's start our conversation here. And let's first off say, this is something that we write in our on our website, and a little graphic about how it works in the soil. Generally, I think these benefits are short-lived. I want to talk a little bit about, I want to stop sharing my screen and talk a little bit about, there we go. And talk a little bit about what you think about cultivation. A lot of guys are asking, hey, nobody's using the field. Can I cultivate? So where do we start with that?
Well, I think it's an opportunity if we can find any benefit in this mess we're currently in. And we do have some people locally. I mean, we're at about the same growth stage you guys are, surprisingly, in the middle of the United States. But still, we're barely starting to mow. The grass is barely starting to green up, et cetera. We're a little bit further on growing degree days and temperature. But that said, since all the fields where community sports are played, the ball fields or whatever, those are pretty well shut down, but they're allowed to be maintained. And I have managers, much like you would, asking me, well, should we do something? And, we've got some fields that rarely get cultivated. And I see that as a door opening for some thatch management and some cultivation management. Also understanding that they don't have the crew, but nor do they have the necessity to bang this out in 24 hours or less and get ready to play on. So I'm going to say those fields that have been neglected for thatch management and cultivation management, this is an open door to get on those fields. But if you went into the winter with a field in pretty good shape and you normally would practice some sort of cultivation, that might be the field I consider not getting on immediately and working on the ones that allow you the opportunity that, the heavy play fields, the youth fields, that sort of stuff. And if they're all mostly native soil with some sand base in your neck of the woods, right?
Right. Okay. So let's take each one at a time here. Let's say there is a field that's a native soil field, and I got a guy or two, and I got one of those wheelie gigs with the just drum things that go in, yo big, and I'm ready to do it. What's the right tool now, in your opinion? We're on the record about hollow tine cultivation and sand-based systems and golf courses, but we're talking about a little bit of a different animal here. So what's the tool you might start with, and how would you approach it?
Well, and I'm going to say that the little whirly gig thing that you described has minimal use for actual compaction alleviation. It's a great overseeding tool. right? It roughs up the soil a little bit on the surface, Frank, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't do much for subsurface compaction, and it makes you feel good. And maybe the people that manage the field say, oh, look, they're out there working, but seriously, you're not doing much. I mean, especially now you under exaggerated a little bit. You know, some of them do actually go to like maybe 2 inches, but they are so superficial at best. And if it's all you can do, and you're overseeding, and you're looking at thatch rather than true cultivation for compaction alleviation, yeah. But most of the time, they're really not that valuable, except in those instances I said. So I'm not a big fan of those. I don't think those drum type, they don't have that hydraulic power on them. They don't have the push power. You know, I really prefer the more golf course centric, you know, vertically operated hollow tine in an instance with a native soil field where you can pull soil up and actually go to a certain depth. And even deep tining, those in our region, at least the deep tiners are still out and doing it. If you have a field that has not seen management and you've got a budget, you know, once again, these are all qualifiers. Right. Yes, maybe you want to go in and aggressively, truly deep cultivate rather than the surface disruption thing you do with those pull behind non-driven type.
Right. So here's the thing for us here in the Northeast now, Roch. We just got a forecast this morning that says we're in for anywhere, I would say, from 3/4 of an inch at the low end to as much as 2+ inches of rain over the next 4 to 5 days. Let's think through the way we approach cultivation from a soil moisture perspective, right? So what kinds of soil moisture conditions on these neglected fields are going to be the kinds of conditions I want to do these practices?
Well, certainly not wet, right? You know, but the drier they are, within reason of keeping the plant alive, the drier they are, the more apt you're going to get to some, in addition, if you're using a coring tine, you know, you'll get some depth, obviously, but at the same time, you know, you get some shattering, even with a slicer tine or a spoon tine or a lot of the things like that. So, you know, you want them on the drier side. When you think about what you just described, so you run it over a field that's dry, and then you get this rain and you've got, you know, silty clay loams or whatever you have in your region. I'm thinking they lean towards the heavier side. Yeah. You know, they expand, and then you've sort of lost what you did. So you're better off looking for a time when you're going to have a period of drying or dry soil, and then get on them with these devices that are actually benefit from the soil being a little bit dry and literally shattering it as they go in and out and moving across it, right?
Okay, so then let's go back to a tool now. If I really like shattering, to me, in a lot of these native soils, I think it's actually one of the fundamental things that, you know, will give you this widespread macropore flow if you hit it in the sweet spot. If you had to pick one thing, would you take a vertidrain with a kick over a hollow tine pulling a core?
No doubt. I would on native soil fields. I don't think there's any question. I believe that I'm much like you. You know, record it today because I think we're in 100% agreement on this, Frank. Record it today. I believe that that's where you get the most benefit. You get continuum of the pores from the surface. You get a lot of things going on that you don't get with a single hollow tine. You know, that kick's important, and most of these devices are designed to give you kick, and you can adjust it on some of them. But even a spoon tine at a different speed will give you a different kick than one at another speed, right? So you want to get as much kick as you ought to, and you want the soil to be a little on the dry side, right? You don't want it wet.
So what about this new concoction, the Air 2G? I know Sorokin's been playing around with it. Have you paid attention at all to that being a non-invasive? Certainly it's slow. And so in some cases it might be good for targeted cultivation, and we're going to get the targeted cultivation in a minute. You don't have to do the whole field. Maybe there's some places where it needs it most. Air 2G, what do you think?
I think just as you just described it, you know, you almost filled in the blanks there, Frank, because I think that you do see some benefit. The speed of it, which is going to be less of an issue now when we're not seeing play on the fields, the speed of it. And I like that prescription area cultivation. You know, if you haven't, you know, we didn't generally do the whole field in one method, right? Well, you've got these little areas that you can do different things on if you have the technology and you know, or the contractor can come in and do targeted prescription cultivation. Sure, I think that there could be some value in the Air 2G. I have not seen the data up close and personal, So I'm not ready to widespread say, yeah, that's the device you want to use.
Right.
But Sorokin is looking at it fairly close, and he's another one. You mentioned some earlier people, premier people in sports turf. Obviously, he's another one of the rock stars, and
Yeah, for sure.
what he's doing is, usually he takes the time and understands it and fully exploits or researches it before he starts making recommendations.
That's
And
exactly.
I don't think he's come out and said, yeah, this is the new tool for the millennial.
No.
This is the new tool that we're looking at, right?
Yeah, and I think he's seeing that. Now let's go back for a second to, bringing up soil for soil's sake or holotine cultivation. How worried should I be in general as a fellow weed scientist? I know you are. How worried will I be about, now my soil's wet. This is a good idea. I'm going to plan to do it in this window in a few weeks. If I'm still not open, blah, blah, blah. How much do we worry later we go with this to create potential weed problems?
That's a great question, Frank, because this is what, if you're on one of your higher maintained fields and you've been routinely applying pre-emergent and doing broadleaf weed control, I don't see bringing soil to the surface as much of a problem, because over time you've reduced the soil seed bank, right? And, this is true in golf, it's true in sports turf. But I worry about a field that's on the margin that doesn't get the aggressive pre-emergent application or post-emergent control for annual grasses or whatever the case may be. So, laying underneath that surface as a fellow weed scientist, there is just a seed bank that's ready to pop. And I don't care whether it's annual bluegrass or crabgrass or, you get goosegrass up in your neck of the woods?
We are alarmingly getting more and more further and further north, says Matt Elmore.
Yeah, so that's alarming because that's not a weed you want, because it requires a whole different toolbox of herbicides to actually get effective control. And in sports fields in our area, goosegrass is far more problematic than crabgrass, because goosegrass loves those compacted soils, right? In front of goal boxes, in the run through on first base, we see goose. If I want to isolate it, I'll go there first, right? That's where you see it. So, so those are the kind of things that I would worry about on a marginal field where you haven't been maintaining it at the level that you might your championship field or whatever, and you're going to bring up a ton of weed seed when you do that, and then also open it up for any weed seed that blows in to fall into this convenient hole that doesn't collapse in on itself as quickly as a spoon tine or a slicer tine or even a solid tine.
Right. So let's talk about a non-invasive way then before we start taking a couple of questions. The airway, we've have been a fan and then not a fan and then a fan in some places of the airway that stands behind a tractor. It's just these knives that go in and makes a slit maybe 4 to 6 inches down. I think maybe you get a little bit of shattering, but the beauty of it is, in my mind, the attraction initially is you can do it really rapidly and it seems to create a slit. Now, we had some problem on our finer fields where it actually does a lot of tearing and seems to cause some sort of browning. But I wonder on these fields that maybe don't get a lot of attention now that we could spend some attention on, practice fields and otherwise. Well, I know there's not a lot of research in this area, but I'm just thinking about the time going in and being really fast to do too.
No, the airway or devices like that, the slicer tine, obviously if you can get it in 3 to 4 to 5 inches, that's better than 1 to 2, because then we, create other issues.
Right.
But, and Minner actually did some work. I was at one of the Iowa State field days when he was still physically on campus, and, he went 2 directions, and everyone wants to go perpendicular. No, you go at an angle and you're sink it pass, right? His data show that you go as an angle and you pick up more surface area as well as more aggressively get better aeration or whatever in the subsoil. So I thought that was intriguing. So he's like, go at a 30 to the first pass, not at a 90. But when he said that on fields that were, typical recreational fields or whatever, he saw that open it up. And then he always, he says, if you're going to slice up a field, you should always throw out seed. And I've always believed that there's a reason for that as well. Because even if you only get 20% germination, you got 20% germination, right? And that seed that wasn't there, and especially on these fields that are less so. So I like the use of a slicer tine, whether it's an airway or whatever. And you nailed it. You can get across a field. You can get across the field
tractor will go
in less time than it takes to do a traditional, vertically operated hollow tine or device like that, right? So you can get on it and get on it frequently too, for that matter. So,
and I think,
I like that idea.
And even if you're at a skeleton crew, I see a few things, guys are still painting their corner lines so they don't have to redo the whole field. They're just going out on the fields and putting in the corner markers so that they can string lines from there. So there's a lot of things guys, even with a small crew, can do to save some time, do these sorts of things. And then the question of, well, I'm a little bit further south. I got a little bit more money. I got this university field or this high-end municipal field. Should I core and consider sand top dressing? I got this sand from last year. What do you like about slinging sand on native soil fields? We've cored them and we're starting thinking, hey, maybe this is a good time to get them a sand cap on them. What do you like that approach, throwing some sand at this time?
I like sand capping if you're committed to doing it forever. If you're committed to doing it once, then that's a horrible combination, right?
Okay, great.
You got to put a cap on it, and that cap has to be developed over time. And it, we didn't, we always revert back to the golf course trade, right? They started with push-up greens, then they started top dressing them, and it's not until they get an appreciable layer of sand on them. So if this is something you just want to do like in the short term and not commit to it, it's a horrible idea.
That's so great. All right, Carl, we got any questions? How we doing?
Doing great. We have no questions. So maybe one thing I had a question on is a lot of people will typically go out, they'll do their core cultivation or whatever cultivation practice, and then they'll go maybe throw some seed and then fertilizer. Thinking about the fertilizer part of that now, is that something you're going to need after you do this cultivation practice, or can you say, hey, maybe I've got a bunch of time and not have to worry about that?
I like that question only because right now you really don't want things growing as aggressively as you normally would, right? So I'm going to say there's adequate soil nutrition to get seed going. And, and then hopefully this is going to break sometime in the not too distant future. I think you said something like late June or whatever. We're a little bit behind you in our region, but, we're looking at probably August before we're going to be through our worst phase. We haven't peaked yet in central United States. So we're going to peak in about 3 weeks with COVID-19. So we're going to be a little bit later, but still, that said, I am not going to fertilize if I don't think it's absolutely necessary and the field says to do it. I think that we're just inviting growth. You've got a limited crew. You're going to increase your mowing. And I'm sure you probably talked about raising mowing heights and maybe the use of growth regulators. Applying fertilizer and growth regulators is kind of contrary to each other. So yeah, I would say, you'd normally put down a starter and you'd normally push it fairly hard because you want that seed to get up and going. But that's because we want to get people on it. That's right. You no longer have that problem, right? So I would not, unless something tells you have to, more times than not, you don't need to put additional fertility down. Good question.
But love the idea of slinging seed, Roch. I mean, you got bare ground. Throw the damn seed. It's got the best chance ever with nobody playing around on it. And you cutting higher. To me, if you've had chronic areas, this is where the targeted precision thing comes from in my mind, is this, goal mouths or where coaches and players stand, or, wherever those pinch points are, focusing in on those areas with a guy or two, you can get a couple of goal mouths done in a day if you want to cut it out and redo it, or just sling some seed as you're passing by. No harm, no foul there, right, Roch?
Oh, no, exactly right. I'm a big fan. And seed, I mean, I know it adds to your budget, but it's not that expensive. And, seriously, when you look at the other things you do on a day-to-day basis, it's not really that expensive. And I would put, even during regular play, under normal times, I would be throwing seed out. And people say, well, you mean ryegrass? I'm not talking about ryegrass. I'm talking about, so if you only get 10% germination, that's 10% more than you had, right?
That's right.
And so, yeah, I'm all for throwing seed out at any time. It was interesting, once again, cruising around with Minner one time in Iowa, and we were taking compaction measurements across these fields. And the worst place is where the players stand. Nothing grows there. Some people have put carpet there to alleviate that problem, but and so I would be throwing seed out there constantly. Right now, every time you do anything and open it up even a little bit, or barriers, like you said, in front of goal mouths, or, wherever the, between the hash marks, where those problem spot exists, let's get a really dense turf going there, because you're going to be mowing higher. It's going to get a really nice root system on it because you're mowing higher. All the things that throw in the agronomy of it that we ignore because we're trying to maintain a slick playing surface, right?
Right.
Throw seed out, no doubt.
And you brought up one more thing, Carl, before we go. We're here almost at the witching hour, and the idea of cutting back mowing, Roch, to root deeper ties in with one of the reasons we poke holes to begin with. If you can do that shattering and combine it with mowing higher and less frequently, those roots will explore the shattering that you do as deep as you do it. Yes?
Oh, no doubt, because what do we tell our introductory students? Where do roots grow? And they say soil, and they'll say no, they grow in the air spaces in the soil. I know that sounds rudimentary, but it's true. If you don't have airspace, you don't get rooting. So
that's right.
Those heavily targeted prescription areas, throw some seed out, get some kind of cultivation in. Native soils, a little bit drier is better, and don't really need to pull a core at this point in time.
Excellent. All right, Carl, I see questions. How we doing?
Yeah, we got a good question from Neil at RIT. So he's asking, I've got a natural soil field, and let's say I'm committed to putting the sand cap on it. How much sand should go down, and then how many times per year? I guess, how quickly can you do that? Could you do that all at once right now? Is that something you're going to have to consider over 2 or 3 years?
So let's start with this, Roch. I think we're in agreement. The cap's got to be about 3 to 4 inches, maybe with a slit drain or something underneath. So I think the superintendents out in Seattle were able to put down 1.5 inches in a single year when they were trying to fight worms years and years ago. But that was ridiculous.
Yeah, it was. They were doing some smothering, and that's a lot of sand in one year, even, right? So we know you're putting on about 1 inch with about 22 cubic yards on, or cubic feet, sorry, per thousand per year. So if you wanted to put on 1 inch, that's what it's going to take. If you wanted to put on 2 inches, it would take twice that. I'm not sure any turf, even under no play conditions, I'm not sure you can aggressively put that much sand on. So you would have to commit. You want to have 3 to 4 inches on the cap. Of course, that's going to change the contour, and you're going to have to move it accordingly, especially in crown fields. If on a crown football field, for example, some of the soccer fields, obviously that's less of an issue, but still you do want some slope on the surface to get water off. If that's important. Native soil fields begin to function by having a crown. Many people don't really think about this anymore because we've had sand-based systems for so long that you don't see the heavy crowns like you used to. So it is important, if you're going to do some capping, that you do it in relation to the subsoil like you would do a putting surface. And really, for it to function, you got to have some drains along the side. You got to have some catch drains. Otherwise, the place where Roch and I just said you get the most traffic by the coaches is where you're putting all the water if you don't pick it up. Yeah, so, it's just gonna pond there. You're exactly right, and the sand will flow, but that on that interface in between, it's gonna saturate top before it goes below, right? So it sheets off, right, and so you get on the side. Eventually you'll get so much on the surface, and there will be some intermixing of roots and stuff that you'll get stability on the surface, but that doesn't happen. Without several years of aggressive top dressing, probably multiple. Core removal if you want to do it more aggressively. Drier soils, you could probably solid tine it and get there just as quick, because I'm a big fan of using the solid tine, even on native fields when they're dry, not when we have the moisture issues we talk about.
Right. All right, Carl, how we doing? Questions?
Good. No more questions. I think we're
right
at half an hour. So, fastest 30 minutes in turf, I think we're calling it now.
Hey, Roch, thanks so much for joining us, pal.
Yeah, happy to join you. Thanks, Carl.
Yep. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody. We'll be right back here next week. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.